Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to cutting through the noise and truly understanding the most critical global issues.
And we're diving straight in today, aren't we? Things are moving fast.
They really are. Just this morning, June 22nd, 2025, we saw the news about U.S. military strikes on Iran's nuclear sites, places like Fordow, Natanz, Isfahan. And the UK Prime Minister was, well, pretty quick to voice support for that action.
Yes, almost immediately. And it comes just after we've seen things like those protests at Braze Norton, the reports of activists damaging RAF planes.
Yeah.
It all feels very connected.
It really does. It throws the whole situation in the Middle East and Britain's role in it into sharp focus, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It highlights this complex, constantly shifting role the UK plays involving history, economics, and hard geopolitical strategy. It's all intertwined.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, that's our mission, to really unpack the UK's intricate role in global defense, foreign policy, the arms trade, particularly looking at the Middle East.
And we've gathered quite a stack of sources for you: official government statements, the big strategic defense reviews, but also critical analyses from different groups.
We want to give you that clear understanding, maybe some surprising facts, the insights that go, a bit deeper than the daily headlines, help you grasp what's really going on strategically.
Okay, so where do we start? Perhaps with that long history.
Yes, let's start there. Britain's enduring footprint in the Middle East. It's fascinating, actually, how British and French involvement really predates the U.S. being the dominant player there.
Oh, absolutely. It's striking how deep that intervention goes, well over a century. You look back at things like the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916.
Basically carving up the Ottoman Empire.
Right, drawing those lines on the map, lines that still define the region, often artificially. Or think about the Balfour Declaration in 1917.
Keep porting a Jewish national home.
Yes, but crucially, as our sources point out, without clearly guaranteeing the rights of the people already living there. That created immediate tension.
And even much later, like the 1953 coup in Iran.
Exactly. The U.S. and UK backing the overthrow of Mossadegh, putting the Shah in power. These aren't just, dusty historical events. They're foundational moments. They've shaped so much of what we see today.
So these historical actions clearly cast a long shadow. How does something more recent, like the 2003 Iraq War, fit into that pattern, especially given how controversial it was back home?
Well, 2003 is a really stark example, isn't it? Britain playing a major role, reportedly against significant public opposition at the time. And the sources we've looked at suggest that intervention unleashed, profound instability. It definitely deepened the perception, right or wrong, that external powers can dramatically reshape and sometimes destabilize the region.
So the history is important context, but this isn't just history. You're saying the UK's strategic presence is very much a current thing.
Very much so. It's not just historical influence. It's a physical, permanent military footprint that many people might not fully appreciate.
Right, like the naval base in Bahrain.
Yes, the naval support facility there. Plus, major logistics bases like Duqm in Oman, the Al Musanna Air Base also in Oman, Al Minhad in the UAE.
And even RAF Akrotiri and Dhekelia in Cyprus.
Exactly. These are described in official documents not just as temporary spots, but as key strategic hubs. They support operations right across the region.
Which naturally leads to the question, why maintain such a significant permanent presence? History is part of it, but what else?
Well, beyond the history, the economic drivers are just huge. You really can't overstate them. Consider this. Roughly 60% of all UK arms exports since 2010 have gone to the Middle East.
60%.
Wow.
That figure alone makes you stop and think, doesn't it? How much does that shape policy?
It has to. And the overall trade numbers are massive, too. Trade with the Gulf Cooperation Council states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, that's valued at around $57 billion a year.
$57 billion.
And within that, over $5 billion is specifically defense exports. It's a massive economic relationship.
And we see that reflected in specific deals, like the Typhoon jets.
Absolutely. The Typhoon program is a major success story for UK defense exports. Oman bought 12 Typhoons plus Hawk trainers. Qatar put in a huge $5 billion order for 24 Typhoons back in 2018.
And they've just asked for more recently.
That's right, another 12 requested. And then there's Saudi Arabia, a really key long-term customer. They bought 72 Typhoons and are reportedly still negotiating for another 48.
So it's clearly not just about selling equipment. It's about relationships, long-term partnerships.
Precisely. And the UK's own Strategic Defense Review explicitly calls the Middle East a priority area. The goals are clear. deepen security ties, expand defense trade, develop technology partnerships, all framed as fostering economic growth back in the UK.
Defense and the economy, just completely linked in this strategy.
It's a very integrated approach.
Okay, so with those deep economic and historical ties, it's maybe less surprising then to see the UK getting involved in the current very tense situation between Iran and Israel.
Yes, which brings us right back to today's news and the broader geopolitical picture.
We saw that joint declaration from the E3 leaders, France, Germany, and the UK. They reaffirmed commitment to peace and stability for all countries,
But also very clearly stated their support for Israel's security.
and made that very strong statement. Iran can never have a nuclear weapon and must not pose a threat to the region.
Which connects directly to the U.S. military action today, those strikes on Fordow, Natanz, Isfahan. The stated aim is precisely that, stopping Iran getting a nuclear weapon.
And the UK stance, Prime Minister Starmer called Iran's program a grave threat, supported the U.S. action to, as he put it, alleviate that threat.
But also urged Iran to come back to the table for diplomatic talks. So support, but also a call for negotiation.
And importantly, our sources note the UK wasn't directly involved in these specific U.S. strikes.
Right. Now, politically within the UK, you see different reactions. Nigel Farage of Reform UK, for example, reportedly backed the U.S. move, framing it in terms of protecting Israel.
Iran must not be allowed to have nuclear weapons, he said. The future of Israel depends on it. That's one clear perspective.
But there are strong counter-arguments, too. The Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, C&D, offers a very different take.
What's their view?
They argue that Israel possessing nuclear weapons itself allows it to act, let's say, with more freedom, potentially inhibiting others from pursuing non-proliferation.
Okay.
And they were very critical of the U.S. pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal back in 2018. They call it nonsense, arguing the deal was actually working to prevent Iran getting the bomb.
Their argument being the withdrawal was more about sanctions and weakening Iran.
That seems to be their contention, yes. That the withdrawal itself perhaps escalated the situation we see now. So you have very different ideas about how to achieve security in the region.
This whole situation really feeds into the UK's own defense planning, doesn't it? Which brings us to that big document, the 2025 Strategic Defense Review.
Yes, and it's quite a sobering document. It paints what it calls a bleaker picture of global security compared to previous reviews.
Bleaker. How so? And what's the big shift?
The big shift is towards what they call war readiness. It's a significant change in tone and posture. It calls for a whole-of-society approach involving industry, reserves, the public, not just the military.
War readiness. That sounds pretty stark. What does it mean in practice? What are they actually planning?
Well, it involves concrete steps. Things like $1.5 billion in investment to create an always-on pipeline for munitions. No more stop-start production.
Okay, continuous supply.
Exactly. And plans for a new defense readiness bill. That could be quite significant legislation to potentially mobilize industry and reserves much faster in a crisis. That's a level of national organization we haven't seen talked about for decades.
And where does NATO fit into this?
NATO is absolutely central. The review talks about the unequivocal need for the UK to step up its support for NATO and Euro-Atlantic security. It makes the alliance the starting point for how the armed forces are developed.
Interesting. What about that Indo-Pacific tilt we heard so much about a few years ago?
That seems to be largely phased out, according to the review. The focus is definitely shifting back towards Europe and the North Atlantic, a clear reprioritization.
And nuclear weapons. Still a cornerstone.
More than ever, it seems. Sustaining the nuclear deterrent is explicitly called defense's top priority.
Top priority.
Yes. Big money pledged to £15 billion for the Sovereign Warhead Program. Plans for building up to 12 new attack submarines. It's a massive, long-term commitment.
So this isn't just about defense anymore, is it? They're framing it as an economic benefit, too. A defense dividend.
That's exactly the language they use. The review really emphasizes how this increased spending is meant to drive growth and jobs back home.
Any examples?
Yeah, they cite things like £6 billion going into munitions contracts, creating over 1,000 jobs. The nuclear warhead program supporting around 9,000 jobs. There's even a new defense exports office within the MOD, specifically tasked with boosting exports.
So jobs, growth, exports, it's all part of the justification for the spending. What about the people in the forces?
And technology. Good point. They acknowledge the workforce crisis, pledging £7 billion to modernize accommodation, trying to stem the flow of people leaving. And technology is huge. The ambition is to be a leading tech-enabled defense power by 2035.
Tech-enabled?
Yeah, setting up new units like a digital warfighter group, a cyber command, really trying to integrate AIs, cyber, electronic warfare into everything.
And how does China fit into this new, bleaker picture?
China is described as a sophisticated and persistent challenge. The focus seems to be on its technological advancement and military buildup, but maybe less of the direct confrontational focus compared to Russia and immediate Euro-Atlantic threats. More watchful, perhaps.
Okay, so we have these big strategic shifts, huge economic factors. But this doesn't all happen smoothly, does it? There must be debates and challenges back home.
Absolutely. Which brings us to accountability and public perception, which are always major factors in defense policy.
Let's start with Parliament's role. Deciding on military action, who actually gets the final say?
Well, technically, it's still a prerogative power. That means government ministers can, in theory, authorize action without a parliamentary vote.
But isn't there a convention now, an expectation that Parliament gets consulted?
There is, yes. An emerging convention, as the sources put it.
Yeah.
But the key word there is emerging. It's not legally binding, and it's applied inconsistently.
How so?
Well, Parliament was consulted over Syria in 2013, 2014, and 2015, but then for further action in Syria in 2018, or strikes in Yemen in 2024, or those wider Middle East actions just last year. No prior debate or vote.
That does seem inconsistent. What's the current governance line on this? Keir Starmer used to support a stronger role for Parliament, didn't he?
He did. Before becoming PM, he argued for a parliamentary lock. Now, in office, his position seems a bit more nuanced. He says he wants the principle of parliamentary consultation entrenched, but that there will be occasions when it is important for a government to act without first coming to this House. So it acknowledges the tension between needing to act quickly and the principle of democratic oversight.
That tension seems central. And speaking of oversight and debate, what about the arms exports themselves? That's always controversial.
Hugely controversial. Looking at the data, the value of specific licenses called seals actually dropped a bit in 2023, down to £5 billion from $8.5 billion the year before.
Okay, a drop.
But, and this is really important, but if you look at the last 5 years, 2019 to 2023, that period saw the highest value of these licenses ever recorded, $27.3 billion.
Wow, so the overall trend is still sharply upwards, despite a dip in 1 year.
That's what the figures suggest.
Yeah.
And who's buying? In 2023, the top recipients were the U.S., then Saudi Arabia, Ukraine, Qatar, and France.
Interesting mix, so not just the Middle East anymore.
Exactly. There's been a noticeable shift. While Middle East sales are still significant, there's been a real increase in exports to European countries. That seems directly linked to European rearmament after the invasion of Ukraine.
So the UK is a major player globally.
Definitely. Still the 7th largest arms exporter in the world, according to the data we have.
Now, groups like the Campaign Against Arms Trade, CAAT, they must have a view on this.
Oh, they have a very strong view. They argue this whole rush towards higher military spending and massive arms deals is diverting money and attention from urgent crises like climate change.
And creating risks.
Yes, they warn it risks a spiraling arms race, making conflict more likely. They also consistently raise concerns about human rights abuses and corruption risks associated with some major customers, specifically mentioning Saudi Arabia and Turkey in their recent reports.
These concerns sometimes spill over into direct action, don't they? Like that incident at Bryce Norton recently.
Yes, that was a very visible example. Pro-Palestine activists reportedly got onto the base, used scooters, paint, crowbars, damaged 2 RAF transport planes.
And their stated reason.
They claim the UK is an active participant in what they called the Gaza genocide, a direct protest against UK foreign policy and alleged military support.
How did the Ministry of Defense respond to that?
Their response was very firm, praising the armed forces, talking about their sacrifice and duty, stating it's the nation's responsibility to support them. A clear defense of the military and its role, starkly contrasting with the protesters' message.
It highlights that deep divide. And it's interesting because the Strategic Defense Review itself actually talks about things like citizens' panels and wanting better public understanding of the armed forces.
It does, yes. There's this stated aim of engaging the public more.
But is it happening? Are people really getting scrutiny?
Well, that's where the criticism comes in. Some of the sources we looked at suggest that actual public and parliamentary scrutiny of the details in the review could be better. So there's a potential gap between the rhetoric of engagement and the reality of deep, transparent scrutiny.
It all paints a picture of, well, complexity, doesn't it? High-level strategy, huge economic interests, the weight of history, and these constant debates about accountability right here at home.
That sums it up pretty well. It's a confluence of all those things.
And that brings us towards the end of this deep dive. We've tried to unpack that really complex, multifaceted reality of UK defense and foreign policy today.
Highlighting those big strategic shifts towards readiness, the undeniable economic stakes, especially in the Middle East, and those ongoing arguments about Britain's role in the world.
We really hope this has given you a more nuanced understanding, something that goes beyond the quick takes and helps you see the bigger picture.
Yeah, hopefully a clearer view of the different forces at play here.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. As the UK commits more firmly to this war-fighting readiness posture, as it really aims to boost its defense industry, what might the long-term consequences be? How could this renewed focus on military strength affect its diplomatic influence, its soft power, its ability to navigate what feels like an increasingly unstable world?
That's the big question, isn't it? Something definitely worth thinking about as these strategies continue to play out.